How is your academic career going if you're at the point where you're talking to anime Dracula and this is a perfectly normal part of it?
I think that
After I turned up at the first ever academic conference on Warhammer 40,000, I was able to pretty easily find an academic who wanted to talk about 40k. Who knew? It is a video worth watching if you enjoy a thing called context. Patrick Prax is an associate professor in the Department of Game Design at Uppsala University in Sweden and knows Warhammer 40,000 in the context of other games. Yes, there are other tabletop war games besides 40k. I was interested in his panel at the conference on rules. To make 40k work, for 40k to be fun, there needs to be more than just the rules made by Games Workshop. Fan missions, fan-created units, the WTC and ITC rule sets which interpret the 40k rules or rebalance them to be functioning. If you played Genestealer Cult after the Codex, the Cult Ambush rules seemed to suggest you were in reserves but couldn't deploy from reserves. The WTC said rules as written, you could rapid ingress as you counted as being in reserves. I doubted it, but then Games Workshop updated it to say you can deep strike. Sort of. I have a short video that explains it better. When the Space Marine Codex was released, there were problems with characters joining units. In the Space Wolf Index, Blood Angels Index, the Deathwatch Index, it said, if a character can join a Vanguard Veteran Squad, it could also join this squad. Then Vanguard Veteran Squads on foot went to Legends and the characters in the new Codex didn't refer to them. So you had to ignore the rules as written, and as players, come up with what is permitted to be joined while we waited weeks and weeks for Games Workshop to fix their mistake. That is with Games Workshop making frequent rules changes, which grows community interest, but they don't come out fast enough to fix problems like the Space Marine character problem, but they also feel like they come out too quickly if you play 40k about once a month. Games Workshop, modern Games Workshop, doesn't much like it when people make their own rules. It takes the power to control the game away from them. And we should have more control in our game, being free to adapt rules to our own tournament, to adapt and interpret Crusade rules, to do what is fun, to have a great day of 40... No, we're not at that part yet. That is at the end. So let's have Patrick introduce himself and the ways he plays 40k.
My name is Patrick Prax. I am currently associate professor at the game design department at Uppsala University in Sweden. That means that I am living on Gotland, which is a nice little island in the Baltic. Now recently gotten a little bit more to the news since Sweden joined NATO as the place where all the NATO jets are flying over, preparing to, defend us against Russia. But yeah, so that's where I am. My research typically centers around games and sustainability. So I've been, for example, presenting in game design conference into different spaces and working on a book that is looking at how to make the games industry more sustainable. And then I'm interested in games and anti-fascism. But I am also playing 40k and have been recently, for example, presenting on the Warhammer 40k conference. That paper was about how the rules of 40k are basically a huge freaking mess with so many different elements that need to go into even being able to play a game. But before that, I've been publishing a little bit on playing 40k on Tabletop Simulator.
How long have you been playing 40k then? Like a couple of years?
Yes, I think now actively playing, the same story like everybody else. As a teenager, as a kid, fascinated, and then now as an adult, when we moved to this island, didn't have so many friends, walked to the game store, started picking up some stuff, and that was fun. So now since I've been playing, I've been gone to a handful of tournaments and mostly playing a tabletop simulator. I have a fair few kids, and the bigger ones have also picked up the hobby and have been playing as well. So yeah. That's really nice and fun. So then we have also the small, diversity, the small neighborhood club in the basement where people come together to paint and play and have super sort of casual rounds, and then Tabletop Simulator, which is...
Can get very competitive on Tabletop Simulator because there's no barrier to having the most meta army, because you just click the buttons you want and you get the unit you want rather than having to buy them and paint them, and then the meta changes and they're no longer good.
That is one huge factor. The other is the self-selection. You will play against people that prepare for WTC.
But I know that tournament style is not how most people play.
I think so too. I think it's massively overrepresented in the way we talk about it. We talk about lists. It was also sort of strange. We typically talk about lists and very, very little about how to actually play. So sometimes I'm wondering why we aren't discussing more about, okay, so this is how you play this aggressively, this is how you position on a table, and mostly this is the units in there, as if that was the only thing that existed around that.
I have
But yes,
noticed that again on YouTube, where it's like, hey, here's this list, it has these units, and it tells you nothing. And then someone will guess how you use those units, and they're completely wrong. It's like, why would you put a dialogus in the unit? The dialogus, obviously, as a character that goes by themselves and completes secondary missions. That's absolutely how they were intended to be used. It's not. It seems like it's absolutely not, but that's how a lot of people use them.
yeah, and that is one thing that's sort of interesting about that. But of course, also we have all of these big YouTubers that are trying to basically professionalize in becoming content creators like that are centered around then doing things like coaching as well, right? So then it's leaning into that sort of perspective. And as you pointed out, I think the vast majority of people, first of all, don't even play that much. The big part of the hobby is, of course, also building and painting your miniatures,
And then you might
figuring
get one game in per month.
exactly, and that would already be quite a bit, right? So one game per month, as typically whatever, like a parent who's working, is that is quite a bit. That game takes a while, right? Like I cannot just every weekend say to my wife, "Bye bye, see you later. I'm going to play with toy soldiers."
Yes, leave all of the children, the many children that make up like a significant part of the island's population.
Yeah, so I just to like I have 6 kids, so it's, it is a fair few. The biggest 3 are playing by now. The next ones will hopefully come. So I'm having
They have no choice.
I can play a team tournament soon by myself.
Just at home, just with them.
Another thing that I think is really interesting about that and about maybe games and play in general is that it's also a space where people make their own games, make their own missions, make their own stories. So in this little neighborhood basement club, we are not playing competitive missions. There's a tournament, and then last time the theme was environmental disaster, and on one map there was like lava rising, and you had to get up on something, and on another one there was meteorites falling, and that was maybe bad if you had a lot of units that took mortal wounds now. Oh, that's so sad. Those poor Elder over there. But yeah,
Whereas here's the Dark Angels, who are relatively immune to mortal wounds. Yeah, it's a whole different meta depending on the table. I did remember in past editions there was a lot of cool, like, now you're fighting mid-apocalypse. There's meteors raining down, lava and fire and ashes spewing up in the ground. Demons are coming! Maybe demons. Yes, there's a lot of fun extra ways and things you can just throw in there, and it sort of works.
Yes, and it's also thinking about that from a bit of a game designer perspective, right? So when I want to get my 10-year-old interested in the game and he likes to play Tyranids, I don't want him to run a competitive game and get, I don't know, murdered by like his brother or somebody. And we set it up as the Tyranids are overrunning this planet. Your units will just respawn and they will come more and more and you will win. The only question is when, right? Mm-hmm. So I can decide what kind of experience I want to have with, in this case, the respective player or a child who's getting into it, and then build the game that way. And I think that sort of creativity that affords is something that we should value really, really highly and really think about how everybody can, on some level, be somebody who also makes the game, not just consumes, gets a new stack, puts it down, and starts moving units, but think about, okay, so what is this activity for me and what do I want to do with it?
It's been a while since, I don't think they did it in 10th edition. I think it was still there in 9th edition that they had the most important rule in the rulebook, which was, you're doing this for fun, so don't be mean to your opponent. Make sure you're both having a good time. That is the most important thing. That is the idea, the purpose of the game. Winning is secondary. Winning is optional. Fun is the most important thing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think then this is something that has changed a little bit over time. So the discourse around the game has shifted, partly more to this competitive, performance-based play, and also because the conversations in the marketing around that have changed, right? So for example, we have now updates on and I think it's nice to have rules updates that come a little bit faster than like every 3 years or something for if something is broken. But also it is really, really difficult to even keep up with that. Like I have been playing one game a week fairly consistently for a while. I've been pretty good at the end of 9th. I managed to win a tournament that was quite competitive. But even for me right now, it's a lot to just keep up with the rules changes.
It is, I think it's designed to be like, this is the only game you play in life. You don't have time for any other tabletop war games because you need to play 40k and keep up with 40k. And the rules are changed, and now 40k is a different game it was a few weeks ago. We're going to have the October balance patch. Well, no, points update, which is going to change things a bit. Maybe there'll be slight rules tweaks, maybe more erratas. They did release an Agents of the Imperium errata, but they didn't fix the Rhino problem, and they didn't fix how Deathwatch veterans with a shield and bolt gun don't have a way to fight in close combat.
Which is also fascinating, right? That people are so hung up on these are the rules as written.
Ah, yes.
Like, come on, like, and these conversations go so far that somebody's, oh, this rule doesn't work right now, so it doesn't function. It's like, do you? I mean, that's not really a rule not functioning. That's you on purpose not understanding communication. So that is an interesting conversation all of itself. How communication typically functions. And to me, as a sort of social scientist, it's amazing that somebody literally assumes that there is a rules as written objective truth to what the meaning of communication is. Because that's not how any of that works. That is fascinating as well. But I mean, I really love that you pointed out the most important rule here, right? Because that making yourself, like I just looked up for fun the covers of the first few White Dwarfs. It's a community journal, right? Like it's a community paper. It's something that you print, sort of punk aesthetics. The politics of that time was sticking it to the establishment in the UK, criticizing Thatcher, highlighting the social
stupidity
injustice
of it all. The whole, I mean, the first Space Marines were taken from the idea of, okay, they are punks taken from the street, hypno-indoctrinated, given armor, and sent back onto the streets to fight the other punks. And that was like, oh, the local police forces in northern England are now fighting the miners that are their families in northern England.
Yes, like these sort of perspectives, right? So nowadays, I think competitive has become a bit of a default. Matched play has certainly become a default. And I think it's a bit of a cop-out to say that, oh, but the rules are just for matched play. Of course, you can use the legends in other ways, but matched play is what most people will play because the other things aren't really taken care of in the same way, aren't curated in the same way.
Boarding Actions has not got a rules up. It took a year to get a rules update, and the rules are not quite there to be even compatible with this current version of 40k, and then not expected to get another update until the end of the edition.
Yes, because I've been doing some of this work around co-creation of games. I've been, for my dissertation, for example, I've been writing here. I have the book lying here about World of Warcraft and modding and how players changed the games that they were playing there in quite considerable ways as well.
I've played some Hearts of Iron, and there are absolutely insane modifications. There's now the world is zombies. Now this World War II game is actually a World War I game. Now ponies run everything, and you are still fighting a global war, but there's ponies.
That is also really, really interesting around that because it is creative, right? It's not just consumption, but it's making culture. And I think that's really, really cool. And creativity and that sort of human connection is super important. I also had, for example, been writing about world first raiding in World of Warcraft. And one of the things I found there is that there was also a space where there wasn't really any useful functioning rules to govern that sort of race. So players became their own referees and set up their own systems on how to govern that. But as soon as somebody else stepped in this case, again, of course, Blizzard, as somebody who's actually now reinforcing meaningful bans or something like that, then they were like, oh, finally, we can play the game. We don't need to focus on also being the referees. And I think that is something that happens quite frequently, that players, in a sense, kind of would like to just play the game and they're just happy to have a rule set and somebody who's doing a passable job as the arbiter of rules.
Yep.
And that has partly happened in 40k as well.
Oh, I think it's definitely happened in 40k. Considering that roughly this time, maybe a little bit earlier last year, I was doing the Index Errors series, where I was going through all of the rules problems in all of the datasheets that I could find, and being like, oh yeah, these Dire Avengers have no close combat weapon. Just assume they have a basic close combat weapon, otherwise the game doesn't function. This person has a bolt pistol, but they don't have a bolt pistol. Assume that they do. It's trying to make it work and be like, yeah, this is how we think it should be. Rules as intended, not going by rules as written. Because otherwise you look at it and say, oh, well, Dire Avengers have no close combat weapon, so it is canon, and lo, it was written, and thus it shall be.
Yes. And exactly, just making like this sort of help, right? Parsing a text to make it playable and function. That is just like one small fraction of all the things that the community does here, right? So not only do we have people who are, and I mean, now Game Structure has already bought a lot of this competency, right? But the entire frontline gaming, setting up all this structure with primary and secondary rules in the first place, and then independent tournament circuit, independent from Games Workshop, right? The WTC setting up the beautifully designed and tested terrain boards and layouts for the tables that now have been included. These were all made by players, right? So the different missions, different ways of balancing. So all of these elements are made by player creators. And that is something that is super common in games and in these sort of participatory cultures, that players build these sort of communities, build these rules, build support structures to teach, to help, to set it up so that everybody can get into these groups or in these communities and play together. And then the company who has somehow the ability to enforce the control via control of some sort of bottleneck, IP, or just being able to be these people who say that our rules are the ones everybody encounters first, so they are the baseline for this. They come in and sort of take all of that over. So then we have the default top-down, sort of reaching down, hiring people who've run Adepticon. Well, that has been a culture that existed there for a while, and suddenly now all of those social connections are connected to Games Workshop. That doesn't really include all the referees, all the people who put up the tables, all the people who year after year made beautiful conversions and beautiful models that are now not allowed on the tables anymore because it's not GW plastic.
Yeah, that's one of my things about Legends. It's like, there's the model or a version of the model, and Games Workshop says, no, don't use them on tables because then people can't buy our models if they do well.
Yes, and that is one thing, right? On the other hand, like if you look at communities like the High Lords of Kit Bashing, right? Like amazing stuff that is so creative, so beautiful, and also a completely fresh rendition of what is the 40K universe, right? The reading of that. Oh, you will never be able to put them on a table because maybe they don't have quite the right measurements, and competitive is important. And oh, but the exocrine's gun can only be like 1 inch further than the base to sneak around. Yeah, right? All of these elements being part of that already, and that is really frustrating. I've seen a beautiful Nurgle demon prince that was made out of driftwood, hot glue, and color, and nothing. Oh yeah, in the end there was like one little blade that made it like a sight. That was the only piece of plastic in there. Amazing, nice. Yeah, beautiful. Wouldn't be able to put it. I would love to play against it. So,
but maybe not at a competitive tournament when you take the model that Games Workshop produce, which is more and more becoming monopose, that, yes, that is how the model is meant to be shaped.
And it's really a strange conversation that you have to have around, I'm playing with toy soldiers here at its base. I would like to have this. And we are highlighting this hobby and this being creative. But now your model has to have the absolutely exact measurements because it's so gameplay relevant. Looking at some of these cases where that has just led to very, very bizarre, of course, also with people misbehaving in strange ways. Like at the heydays of Harlequins building their Void Weavers, so nose up, so that they can all be shoved inside a ruin. I think that was a London or something. And yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's creative at least.
Yes, exactly. But that is clearly bad faith, right? So I wouldn't tolerate that at a competitive event either. But then that doesn't mean that we need to sort of overcorrect it and say it has to be one specific way to build and creativity. But just recently, Magic the Gathering, the commander format has gone back to Wizards of the Coast, right? Yet another element where player created culture was basically more popular than the original game.
Yep.
And now it has gone back to the company, even though they've been making commander cards that had commander stuff on them, text and rules on them already, even though it wasn't their game actually. So this sort of overreach and taking back control corporate is really the problem.
Some people are like, oh, it's fine because now Games Workshop has said the rules we were playing with and made up ourselves are now the official rules, which can sort of be like, I got the nod from the people who made it. It's appreciation. Senpai noticed me.
Exactly, that what it sometimes feels like, right? This sort of subservience to our corporate masters. Quite early on, with the early White Dwarfs or early Games Workshop, there was a clear understanding, also in the tone, that these are just nerds like you who write down their homebrew ideas and hope you like them. But man, just have fun, like go nuts.
Yeah.
And that isn't really there anymore. You aren't considered to be another player, another enthusiast who uses these funny miniatures to do cool stuff with. You are now a customer. And you are supposed to buy this and be glad that you get it. And then we have all these sort of conversations around, and we should have these conversations around where are the problems with this? Because really players have been taking over making rules for this game because Games Workshop quite frequently did a pretty poor job at it. So now they are doing better, but we see the discontent with, for example, as in your previous video you discussed, the app and the structures in which you cannot, as an honest-to-God player who wants to only read Games Workshop stuff, actually find a useful way of looking at all the rules together. You will have to go to some sort of third-party website or another space. All the places to build armies together are from somebody else. The rules that have been built and coded in and structures that are created by rules teams that are setting up, for example, Battlescribe or these sort of libraries, that go unrewarded, unrecognized by most players, even though without those people, you could straight up just not play the game. You would have to find another workaround.
They had that with Age of Sigmar, especially. Someone just by himself made an Age of Sigmar army creation for like 2nd edition, 3rd edition. And then he said, oh, I'm not doing this anymore. Games Workshop just been hosting that on their website. He wasn't getting paid as far as we know.
That's amazing.
He was just doing it for fun. And now they've had to make their own one, which sort of is okay, but basically is on the same level as the 40k app.
Yes, and that is fantastic, right? That you have this billion-dollar corporation in negotiations with the European Union. I heard about that. Games Workshop is making a higher profit and is more selling more wares to the European Union than the entire UK fishing industry.
Yes, so that does come up as well. That's something we've heard.
Yes, and that's sort of fascinating that it's still taking. It's like, oh, but it's like a small sort of nerdy. It's like no. And the subscription model that you're mentioning, or that you have mentioned before, from a perspective of sort of being, my PhD originally is in media studies, so I have this sort of political economy approach that I often use when I look at things. That means that I'm wondering where does the money come from and how does that decide what kind of things are happening in the space. So if you look at the tech business structures, then for the most part, and this is also a problem for digital gaming, a product isn't evaluated or funded based on what kind of money it's making right now, but based on the future outlook on when it can become the platform for culture production. That would be a perspective that we would call platform capitalism. And it's trying to understand how this sort of creation of platforms for productivity and for creating culture is impacting how we make culture, right? So Facebook has been trying to become, and has been pretty successful in becoming such a platform. We have Apple, we have like Microsoft vying for that, all of these sort of big companies. And that is sort of the model in which you can get evaluated with your company way higher than how you currently sell product. So something similar makes sense as a pitch for Games Workshop to really optimize for getting these sort of investment perspectives on their own work. That wouldn't be trying to be seen as a company that makes cool miniatures, but trying to be seen as the company that might own the future platform for miniature gaming. And it's already going there. For the most part, if we talk about miniature gaming, we talk about Warhammer or we talk about 40k.
Yes.
You
a lot of people say, yes, I am a Warhammer fan. They don't describe themselves as a war gamer. Even because so many war games out there, but you just play that one. So yeah, it looks like Games Workshop will be the one that gets the monopoly, or as good as a monopoly on wargaming.
Yes. And the next step then, of course, would be all of these things that we've seen starting happening, getting all the animation and fan creation of culture in-house, and whatever doesn't follow that sort of lead will get punished, will be excluded, will get sued. Bringing competitive gaming in-house, that means taking over first all the rules writing, then running the biggest events just by power of throwing money at it, taking over that sort of culture.
I do find it weird that when it's like, oh yeah, here's your golden ticket to the event, that doesn't give you like free entry. It doesn't give you free travel to get there. It doesn't cover your hotel costs. It's just you have a ticket, so you don't need to risk missing out on your online purchasing things. Oh wow, thanks Games Workshop. You're really funding me to be the best Battle Sister player in the world.
Yes. And I mean, there, of course, the economic structures for players getting in, that has been an issue for a while. And I think some WTC teams have been trying to create a funding pot so that they could maybe, if there's a young player somewhere and it's really good, fund the trips for them. But of course, there's huge socioeconomic differences, and 40K and WTC and all of these spaces are still massively privileging the Western world and are super Anglo-centric.
Yeah, you can see where they take place. It's, let's see, Canada, United States, UK, France, United States.
Yes.
And maybe one in Germany.
Yeah, and I mean the Nordic countries with Sweden, of course, also insanely wealthy and privileged, right? So then we have some of these sort of spaces like here. That still leaves it so that Games Workshop can try to take that over, right? And we've seen that. So that might mean that for the next time, I mean, there was already trouble with the big tournament in Las Vegas Open and what would be considered the end of the season, and when the release for the next rules come out, we have seen as some sort of discontent. Of course, then the aim of Games Workshop would be to get control over all of these manifestations of 40K as a platform, so that in the end point, if you want to run your little tournament, you register with them. Then they get perfect data for all the players, for all the structure, like basically just get more control over this entirety of their culture. Then everybody will have to have the app, anyways, already needs to pay for having the cards that you need to draw the missions, right? I mean, again, as a game designer, when I talk to my students in the classroom, we talk about when would you use cards? What is the point with cards, right? Cards have certain specific physical properties. You can hide information, you can shuffle them, you can do all of these kind of things with them. But also, hey, you wanted to add some cards, you need a new deck, instead of just giving you a few cards sent out to you on whatever, the White Dwarf, where every like local game store gets the updated cards. That would be possible. Every player needs to buy a new deck, and needs to buy a new box, and needs to update their rules. So that is exactly that subscription, and pushing that forward. That is, of course, the investor pitch here. That gives them control over, you will only ever run their plastic at anything at any of these events. You would be in their databases, you would be running their sort of digital in their digital environment. That makes them the platform for gaming. For somebody who values the creativity of that and the beauty that comes with making culture and setting up your own games and making your own miniatures and just telling your own stories, that sounds a little bit like a tragedy around what this culture could be.
Games Workshop is thinking, we need accurate sales data and accurate models data. We see that 35% of people registering for games are playing Space Marines, so we know we can push Space Marines even more. Loads of people are using this particular unit. Great, we can predict we're going to sell so many of them at a such and such profit. Yeah, I don't feel like they're making rules for me anymore.
No, I don't think they are. And I mean, they could be. Like in a world where you would, for some reason, perfectly trust a corporation, you could say that if they have the data also for the smaller games and for the people who aren't as high level, and maybe they could try to build stuff that's playable here as well. But I don't really see any reason for why that is happening. I've seen growth for the most part in areas that are around competitive, that pull in more and more players and are really rising steeply in terms of tournaments and that sort of stuff. And that will pull in more and more players. That is the power users who maybe initially spend more money on it, but it's not the people who play with their kids and like have this as a sort of shared culture, right? Like, I mean, when we were in the last tournaments, my children were the only children there. There was nobody else. Everybody else was obviously adults. And maybe that is something that just flies under the radar and I maybe wouldn't have noticed. But for me, it was pretty obvious, right? Like there was two kids that were maybe like the kids of players, but they weren't themselves playing. My children were the only ones that brought an army and played. And people were super nice to them. And it was a super friendly atmosphere and totally a safe space where I can trust that everybody's going to be nice to them, and they aren't winning their games, so they aren't in the winning bracket for this. So everybody's chill and having a good time, and that's beautiful. But there's just no more other kids in the space. And then people go like, "Oh, I wish we would have more young people joining the hobby." It's like, yeah, then we need to make a different hobby or a different entry point because this is not it.
Yeah, I don't know if they still run the school league. I think they do. Yeah, they still have like school leagues in some places where it's, hey, you get a basic pack, and then you tell the kids basically to buy a Space Marine and a Stormcast Eternals army, and then you sort of give them some rules. Very small games, like skirmish level games to get the children in, and then they can go to Games Workshop with their parents and buy loads of models.
Yep. If they can afford that. but yes, the making part of it, I think, is really, really nice, right? Also for the smaller ones, like painting and making, and they don't really care what the stats of the model are. They want to make something fun and something cool. So yes, that is, and I mean, one of the things to maybe do there is, I mean, as you pointed out, there are other games. Like one of the games that I think is really interesting is Open Combat, because it says just download the PDF and then you have rules that you can use for whatever miniatures you want and make playable armies with a fairly accessible rule set. There's a game that a friend of mine makes here in Sweden that's called F28 that has different, little bit different rule books that you can completely play with Warhammer miniatures that have armies that would fit into that. So there's these sort of things. And of course, there's a lot of people out in the community who write their own crusade rules, their own campaign rules, their own perspectives on how you could play a little bit differently 40k.
And if there's a unit that doesn't have rules, they're like, oh, I made one. Now we can use it. Hey, I did that before with Celestians with guns. Didn't have rules, now they sort of do.
Yes, right? If you want to play Skaven in 40k, there's community rules for that. Yeah, so, of course I want to do that.
Cheese stealers. They're called the cheese stealer cult.
Ah, perfect. Yeah, of course. They have this aesthetic, that is true. Like send in the yeah. I mean, I just want war flamers. Green fire, that's what I'm going for. Yeah, I see. This is like I mentioned. This is my little patriarch here. When painting is involved, I am just a sucker for the Necron green glowing color, and that goes at some spot of every miniature. I just really, really like that. So yeah, that
have
that
glowing
is,
eyes.
yeah, exactly. So that is.
I do like the painting and the building part of it, where you can be like, this unit is going to be like this, not because these are the best weapons, because that's going to change in a few months' time as to what is the best weapons. But to be like, I like this hammer, this man will have a big hammer, and go with that.
Yes. No, I like that too. And that's the thing. Like, I mean, I like to play competitive as well. Like, it's not like I don't like that. I like that it's so complex that playing a game like that completely envelops me, and I just sort of get in this flow state and mentally just disappear in the game and get out of it in 3 hours, and that's fun. That's nice.
It's weird that we can't do that. Like, normal 40k games will take 3 to 4 hours at 2,000 points, but suddenly you put yourself in a tournament setting and it does take like 2.5 hours. It's weird. It's weird that it does that.
Yes, yeah. and it's fun. Like, that's nice.
Oh yeah,
but that's not the only thing. That's not the only
thing.
It's
one way to play.
Exactly, that is just one way to play. And also, going to a tournament, it's expensive. It's tricky to do when you have kids. Super exhausting. So you have your work week, then you go to the tournament, then you come back.
Yeah, I mean, the tournament's going to be 9 hours at least.
Yes, exactly. So it's big fun, but it's a large commitment, and that means also that it includes most people who can't really play that way. So framing that as the only way to play 40k, that just isn't true.
You need to be near a tournament area that's going to have a large enough people that's going to do it. So if you live in, say, an isolated Scottish village, you're not going to be playing tournaments. Even if you have a Games Workshop, you could go to like once a month to pick models.
Yes, and the UK is still fairly privileged because there's so many shops and tournaments in comparison to the size of the country. In Sweden, there's still a fair few, but because it's such a long place, you still will have to travel quite a bit.
Yes.
But yeah, in many other places, it's just not possible. And for us, it, for example, means having to get off the island first. So then that's a ferry trip on top of it. It's nice that there's an opportunity to do it online, but it's just not the same thing.
I like to move the plastic around, and when the dice make the click-clack noise, it's a nice feeling. 40 dice in your hand is so much better than just clicking a button and then the dice happen.
I agree. I also like the button, and I think that thing has been built in an interesting way to give you a similar feeling, right? That's something that I have a little like written in my article about that. This feeling of like, this is the important charge. My, I don't know, whatever, Swarmlord into Malnius Kalgar. Let's see how do I make it. And in the game, in the real space, you would walk over around the table and then come and you both watch. But in Tabletop Studio, the same happens. The person will still move their camera
to see the same spot. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's kind of a fascinating thing, that you could look at your little camera, but no, you go over there. So there's a physicality moment that is like this collective storytelling still happens in a way. So that's kind of fun that it's built that way. But of course, you're right. The community, the going to lunch or going to dinner afterwards, that thing just doesn't happen, and that is also super important. I think that is sort of my main point around this. You're right that people play the games very, very differently and with different motivations and with different aims and different settings. And I think that is something that is beautiful about it. There's a bias in the way we typically think about 40K that is having to do with it being more and more commodified, more and more professionalized, and more moved towards competitive upwards. And I think some of the reasons for that, of course, are that people would like to have a functioning rule set so that if you come to the table, you know what the rules are. But also, these rules are being created with in the mind of the company that's publishing them, moving also control towards them and having more control and then more possibilities to commodify play in our shared culture. And I think that that is a little bit of a tragic situation here. And we should try, where we have the possibility to do that, to resist that, to move creativity and to move making culture downwards and to maintain that part of the culture and that part of cultural making that makes this so valuable in the first place.
Making your own tournaments, making your own narrative campaigns, making your own missions. Done that before. It didn't do great as a video, which was a shame, but yeah, that's the sort of thing we should be doing. Making your own rules, and as long as your opponent is fine with them, there you go. You are now playing 40K the way you want to play 40K, not the way Games Workshop wants you to play 40K.
Yes, and that is also, by the way, if you play against somebody who's really good at the game and is whatever playing on a competitive level, for the most part, if you go like, "Hey, can I try this?" They go like, "Sure, let's try." Right? Like,
yeah.
I'm curious to see how this does. That is another element of it, like sort of that guy who's using whichever possible rule to get advantage. Sure, they might have a problem with it, but you're actually sort of tournament players outside of, yes, this tournament setting where they are, I don't know, trying to get into the local team or whatever, they will be like, sure, let's do that. Let's try that.
I've
Let's try how that
definitely
goes.
seen that. Some people who are like, oh, I want to get good. I want things to be absolutely perfect, like clinical playing 40K, no legends units, none of this. We do it like sterile so that it's always the same game. The actual competitive 40K players who want to be good will be like, you play whatever army you want in whatever way you want. I need to know how to adapt. Being able to adapt to the situation is how you win 40K, not having a list written down of where your models move and what they shoot.
Exactly. And that's something that in most walks of life, the people who are actually really good at that, they are also social, friendly, and inviting you to try and do your own thing because they don't actually have anything to prove. Yes, so that is really nice as well, right? Like, it's just a little story, right? The first bigger tournament that I went through, and I went with my oldest son, so he was 12 at that point. And for his first game, he was on the table playing against Neil Kerr, the at that point head judge of the WTC. So it was the deep end of the pool from that perspective. But we had a really good time, and yeah, Neil was like super nice to him, and Felix, my son, still has the dice that he got as a nice present and as a nice sort of memory of that sort of time. And that is the coolest thing there, right? You have a super competitive player walking up to his first table, meeting a kid and going, "Hey, let's make this a cool memory for you."
Yeah.
And that is the kind of 40K that I think is so.
That's what I like. How is your academic career going if you're at the point where you're talking to anime Dracula and this is a perfectly normal part of it?
I think that I don't know how's my career going. I think it's pretty good that I can do this. The situation that many academics I think find themselves in, that publish or perish, is so that isn't super much a problem. But I've seen that just sitting in my ivory tower and accumulating more perspectives and sort of truth about the world without being able to share them with anybody is very, very frustrating.
Yes.
So I've been recently pivoting to trying to get more possibilities to bring that knowledge into a way that is useful in doing something in the world. So we have been, for example, organizing a 2 days or 3 days event at the Swedish Democracy Festival that we are hosting here that has to do with games in contemporary culture and games in democracy, but also sort of problematic elements with neo-fascist recruitment and game communities and these sort of perspectives, problem gaming, gaming sustainability. I went to GDC to talk about that, and we're working on a book for the games industry about that. I'm working with schools to talk about critical game literacy, to tell young people what kind of things to maybe watch out for in games where they become predatory or manipulative, or problems in games culture that can be sort of this possibility of bringing that sort of knowledge and these perspectives out into a bigger part of our shared cultural discourse is something that we should do more as academics. And that's what I've been really pushing for recently, is trying to get these perspectives to be accessible for people outside of the ivory towers of contemporary academia. So from that perspective, I am happy to talk to animated Dracula. There you go.
Excellent. As long as everyone's happy. As long as we have fan creations to beat the bad stuff from Games Workshop, like their horrible app, then everyone, in their own way, can have a great day of 40k.